What if the most sacred prayer you've whispered your entire life was never meant to be said the way you were taught? This one shift in understanding could rewrite everything you thought you knew about faith, language, and the divine. Every morning, across cracked kitchen tables and echoing cathedral halls, in whispered hospital rooms and roaring stadiums, billions of voices murmur the same words. They rise like incense, ancient syllables slipping through modern mouths. Our Father, who art in heaven, familiar, comforting, sacred. But what if the words you've repeated since childhood under your breath before bed, recited at funerals and weddings, mumbled in moments of fear or faith, never meant what you thought they did? This is not just a prayer. It is a formula, a ritual, a declaration. And it is also a code. Spoken by Christ 2,000 years ago in a language few now understand, filtered through centuries of empires, councils, translators, and agendas. From Aramaic to Greek, from Latin to King James English, each translation reshaped the edges of what was said. Each scribe chose which words to smooth, which to sharpen, and which to leave behind in the dust. Think about that. For 2,000 years, the most repeated prayer in human history has traveled through time like a ship battered by storms. It has been outlawed, reworded, reinterpreted, chanted, carved into stone, stitched onto pillows, sung by monks and shouted by televangelists. And in all of that noise, something got lost. Because the prayer isn't just about reverence. It's a map, a cosmic map hidden inside ordinary phrases. Kingdoms, power, bread, temptation. These are not just moral ideas, they are coordinates, anchors to a world behind the veil. The disciples didn't ask Jesus how to preach. They didn't ask how to lead armies or gather followers. They asked him how to pray. And what he gave them was not a sermon. It was a mechanism, something whispered in secret that could reshape the one who spoke it. But over time, repetition became routine. Meaning got buried beneath familiarity. We hear the words but do not hear the roar beneath them. We say them, but do not see the door they unlock. For most, the Lord's Prayer is a lullaby, something to soothe. But originally, it was a call to arms, a whisper meant to defy empire, awaken the soul, and summon the divine into the dirt and dust of human life. So when you say the words again tonight, pause. Ask yourself not what do they mean, but what have they always meant that no one ever told you? Because these are not just the most recited words on earth, they may be the most misunderstood. In the first century, the word Father did not mean what it means to you now. It was not soft. It was not sentimental. It did not evoke warm images of bedtime stories or protective arms. To call someone Father in the world of ancient Judea was to invoke structure, authority, lineage, and law. It was tribal. It was political. It was sacred. And above all, it was never meant to be private. When Jesus opened the prayer with Our Father, he was not offering comfort. He was declaring a revolution. Because in that world, gods had names, they had territories, and they had chosen people. The divine was not accessible to all. It was mediated through priests, bloodlines, and temples. Every nation had its own god, every god its own rights. But this was different. Jesus does not say, my Father. He says, our Father. And suddenly, the distance between tribes collapses. The barriers between castes fall. Fishermen, lepers, Roman soldiers, widows, tax collectors, foreigners, all are folded into one family. That single word, our, was explosive, dangerous. In a society built on purity codes and separation, to say our was an act of holy rebellion. And then there is Father. In Hebrew tradition, Avinu, our Father, was reserved for moments of national crisis, communal repentance, or deep covenant. It was not thrown around loosely. It echoed with the thunder of Mount Sinai, with the cries of Exodus. Calling God Father was not cozy. It was cosmic. It meant acknowledging the Creator not just as ruler, but as source, as origin. as one who shapes destinies. Yet in the Roman world, pater meant something even more. The paterfamilias had absolute control. Life and death, punishment and inheritance, it all flowed from him. To call God Father was to challenge Caesar himself, who was called Father of the Nation, Son of God, Prince of Peace. The Lord's Prayer didn't just uplift it, undermined. It declared loyalty to a higher authority than empire. A kingdom not made by human hands. So the next time you whisper, Our Father, ask yourself, do you understand what you're invoking? You're not just speaking to a loving parent. You are placing yourself inside a lineage that spans eternity. You are aligning with a creator who is not yours alone, not personal property, not private genie, but the breath behind all things. This Father is not small. This Father is not safe. And this Father does not belong to you. You belong to Him, along with every other soul who's ever dared to utter those same two words. You hear it, and you picture clouds. A man with a beard on a throne, maybe a choir, maybe gates. But that's not what they heard. When Jesus said, Who art in heaven, He wasn't pointing to a distant sky. He wasn't describing a place you go when you die. He was naming something closer, stranger, more real than the world beneath your feet. In Hebrew thought, heaven was not singular. It was layered, plural. The word was shamayim, literally heavens. Multiple realms stacked like unseen veils, each one vibrating at a different frequency. The first heaven was the air around your head, the breath in your lungs, the place where birds flew and clouds drifted. But beyond that were other layers, dimensions where angels moved, where prayers traveled, where the unseen touched the seen. So when the prayer says, Our Father who art in heaven, it's not pushing God away. It's not exiling Him to a far-off place beyond the stars. It's doing the opposite. It's locating Him in every layer of reality, in the wind that touches your face, in the silence between your thoughts, in the mystery behind the laws of physics. The phrase doesn't speak of distance, it speaks of depth. To art in heaven was never meant to suggest separation. It meant divine immanence, a presence that surrounds you, permeates you, holds you even when you feel abandoned. It means God is not stuck in some celestial retirement home. He is layered into the very fabric of what island, and He is always listening. The ancient mystics believed that to enter prayer was to move through heavens, to pass through realms not with the body, but with the heart. The first heaven was distraction, the second was memory, the third was longing, and beyond that silence, fire, glory. So saying, Who art in heaven was not about reminding yourself where God lives. It was about reminding yourself how far your soul must travel to see Him clearly. We turned it into geography. Jesus meant it as geometry, not height but dimension, not up but through. So no, heaven is not what you think. It is not far. It is not later. It is not made of clouds and harps. It is laced into now, pressed into this very moment like ink on paper. And maybe that's the point. When you pray, you are not sending a message upward. You are stepping through a veil. And on the other side of that veil, He is already waiting. You say it without thinking, Hallowed be thy name. But do you know what you're saying? Do you know what you're touching with your lips? This isn't just a compliment. It's not just reverence. It's an invocation, a trembling, a fire. Because in the ancient world, a name was not just a label. A name was a presence. When Jesus spoke of God's name being hallowed, He wasn't speaking poetry. He was stepping into one of the oldest and most dangerous traditions in human history. The Hebrews had a name for God that was so sacred it was never spoken aloud. 4 letters, Yod, He, Vav, He, the Tetragrammaton, a breath more than a word, a name that no one was allowed to pronounce. Not even the priests, except once a year, and even then, only behind the curtain, only in the innermost room, and only with blood on their hands. To speak the name of God was to risk everything. Because to name is to summon, and to summon is to stand exposed before something that cannot be controlled. In the desert, the name was wrapped in fire. In the temple, it was hidden behind layers of incense and gold. Over time, the people stopped saying it entirely. They used titles instead: Adonai, Elohim, Hashem, the name, anything to avoid the unbearable holiness of those 4 letters. To hallow the name wasn't to whisper it, it was to guard it like a living flame. So when the prayer says, "Hallowed be thy name," it's not telling God to be holy, it's reminding you to approach with awe, to speak with caution, to recognize that this isn't a casual conversation, it's a crossing into sacred ground. In ancient rituals, fire was used to purify before approaching the divine. Hands were washed, clothes were changed, even breath was held. Because to say the name was to risk bringing heaven down in a flash of light. Jesus didn't throw this phrase in for poetic rhythm. He knew exactly what it meant. He was lifting a veil that others had sewn shut. He was letting ordinary people touch the untouchable. And yet, he warned them, hallow it. Do not treat it lightly. Do not drag the sacred into the mud of familiarity. Every time you say those words, you're standing where Moses stood, where the bush burned, where the ground itself became holy. This is not just prayer. It is fire disguised as language. And the name? It is not safe. It never was. But it still answers, when spoken, in awe. You've been taught to think it's coming someday. A trumpet blast, a throne descending from the clouds, the end of time, the final judgment. But when Jesus said, "Thy kingdom come," he wasn't pointing to the distant future. He was igniting a rebellion in the present. In the world of first-century Judea, kingdoms weren't metaphors. They were banners, armies, taxes, and swords. Rome's eagle loomed over everything. Caesar was not just emperor, he was called the Son of God, the bringer of peace, the Lord of Lords. Every coin, every decree, every soldier reminded the people who really ruled the earth. So when Jesus opened his prayer with the words, "Thy kingdom come," it wasn't a soft request for a better tomorrow. It was a declaration of war, not with weapons but with allegiance. He was claiming that the true kingdom didn't belong to Rome or to any earthly empire. It belonged to God. And not just in heaven but here. Now, inside, Jesus didn't just talk about the kingdom, he embodied it. He healed the sick without permits. He forgave sins without temple sacrifice. He dined with tax collectors, touched lepers, shattered purity laws. Everywhere he went, the rules of the old world bent. The kingdom he spoke of wasn't waiting in the clouds. It was erupting through cracks in the system, leaking out in miracles and mercy. That's what made it dangerous. That's why it got him killed. Because "Thy kingdom come" wasn't a polite religious phrase, it was a refusal to bow to the powers that be. It meant rejecting Caesar's version of order. It meant pledging loyalty to a different kind of rule, one built not on domination, but on justice, compassion, and truth. And even more unsettling, Jesus said the kingdom was within you, not above, not beyond, but inside, like a seed waiting to awaken, like a spark hidden in the soul. So when you whisper those words, "Thy kingdom come," you're not asking for clouds to split. You're not waiting for angels with flaming swords. You're inviting the divine to take root in your choices, your voice, your silence, your courage. This is not passive. This is not postponed. This is the most dangerous part of the prayer, because the moment you pray for God's kingdom to come, you are also praying for every false kingdom to fall, and that includes the ones built inside your own heart. The kingdom isn't someday, it is already knocking. You've said it 1,000 times, "Thy will be done." But have you ever stopped to ask what that actually means? Is it surrender, obedience, submission to something bigger than you? Or is it something deeper, something older than religion? Something written not just in scripture, but into the bones of creation itself. In the ancient world, the will of God wasn't just a list of commands. It wasn't a set of arbitrary rules. It was the very structure of the universe. The rhythm behind the stars, the invisible thread that held everything together. To align with the will of God was to step into harmony with the source of all life, and to resist it was to go against the grain of reality itself. Jesus wasn't just teaching people how to behave. He was showing them how to return, how to realign with the divine frequency that hums through all things. That's why he didn't just say, "Do God's will." He prayed for it to be done here, on earth, as it is in heaven. Not forced, not imposed, but revealed, manifested, embodied. In the mystical traditions, there's a belief that heaven operates according to perfect order. No resistance, no confusion. Every being, every force, every movement exists in perfect balance with divine intention. So when Jesus prays, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," he's asking for that balance to break through. For this fractured world to remember its original song. It's not about control, it's about alignment. The same way a tuning fork resonates when it hears its note, your soul was built to respond to something ancient, something holy, something true. You feel it in moments of clarity, in beauty that makes you weep, in justice that makes you rise. That's the will of God, not a command shouted from above, but a song calling you home. But that also means it's not passive. To pray for God's will is not to say, "Do whatever you want, I give up." It's to say, "Let me be part of the healing. Let me carry a piece of that will in my own hands." Because the will of God doesn't descend like lightning. It grows like a seed. Through you. So the next time you whisper that phrase, don't picture a distant deity pulling strings. Picture the structure of the cosmos folding gently into your heartbeat. Picture heaven tuning earth. Picture your soul remembering something it has always known but maybe forgot how to sing. That is the will. And it is not waiting. It is already unfolding. You've heard it so many times. It just blends in on earth as it is in heaven. It rolls off the tongue like the end of a sentence you've never questioned. But to those who first heard it, this wasn't just poetic. It was dangerous. It was mystical. It was the invocation of a pattern older than any empire and deeper than any doctrine. As above, so below. That phrase didn't start in a church. It echoes from ancient temples, from stone-carved altars buried beneath centuries of dust. It comes from the Hermetic tradition, whispered by sages and scribes who believed that all things in the cosmos mirror each other. That what happens in the higher realms reflects in the lower. That spirit and matter are not separate but braided, bound, twinned. When Jesus taught the prayer, he was not just giving comfort, he was giving keys. That line, "On earth as it is in heaven," is not passive. It's a command, a bridge, a portal. It means that heaven is not some later place of reward. It's a blueprint. And earth? Earth is the workshop, the clay, the echo. In the ancient mind, heaven was order, harmony, wholeness. A realm where the will of the divine was not resisted, where light moved freely, where every being knew its place and purpose. Earth, by contrast, was chaos, fragmented, wounded. But through this prayer, Jesus calls for the upper world to descend into the lower, for divine harmony to saturate human reality. Not symbolically, literally. The mystics believed that by speaking the right words with the right intention, you could reshape reality, not manipulate it, but reveal its true form. The line between prayer and magic was thin, and this phrase, "on earth as it is in heaven," was the heart of that power. It wasn't wishful thinking, it was manifestation, but it came with responsibility. Because if you say those words, you are not just asking for peace, you are agreeing to carry it. You are not just hoping for justice, you are committing to build it. You are not just dreaming of heaven, you are daring to drag it down into the dust of your daily life. Heaven is not waiting. It is whispering. Through dreams, through beauty, through acts of courage that ripple far beyond what you see. When you pray on earth as it is in heaven, you are placing yourself in the current of something vast, something ancient. You are standing at the meeting point of above and below, of spirit and flesh, of eternity and now, and the echo is already moving. When you pray for daily bread, you probably picture something warm and simple, a loaf, a meal, a basic need met by a generous God. But in the ancient world, and in the language Jesus actually spoke, that line meant something far stranger, far deeper, because the word used for daily in the original text doesn't exist anywhere else in the Bible. Not before, not after. It's a mystery word, epiousios, and it has haunted scholars, mystics, and translators for centuries. Some said it meant necessary. Others said it meant future. Still others believed it referred to something beyond the physical entirely, something eternal, something sacred. In the desert, the Israelites were fed with manna from heaven, but it wasn't ordinary food. It came without warning, melted in the sun, and could not be hoarded. It arrived with the morning dew, as if whispered by the sky itself. And the people called it, "What is it?" because they didn't even know how to describe it. Jesus echoes that mystery here. He doesn't say, "Give us what we want." He doesn't even say, "Give us what we need." He says, "Give us that bread, that strange, holy, and now and not yet kind of nourishment. The kind you can't buy, the kind you can't earn, the kind that shows up exactly when you need it and disappears the moment you try to control it." Some mystics believed this bread wasn't bread at all. They said it was breath, spirit, wisdom, the breath of God that hovered over the waters, the word that became flesh, the silence between heartbeats where the divine still speaks. To ask for daily bread was to say, "Feed me with what I cannot name. Sustain me not just with calories but with clarity, with presence, with truth." It is a prayer for survival, yes, but also a prayer for awakening. And even the word bread carried layered meaning. In Jewish tradition, bread was sacred. It was used in ritual, broken at tables of covenant, multiplied in the wilderness. Symbol of body, symbol of unity, symbol of heaven coming down in a form you could touch and taste. So when you whisper, "Give us this day our daily bread," pause. You are not just asking for food. You are asking for manna, for mystery, for the kind of soul sustenance that keeps you alive when everything else falls away. You are asking to be fed by what the world cannot offer and what the ego cannot hold. And if you listen closely, you might feel it already arriving, quiet, fleeting, holy, just like manna, just like breath. It depends on which version you grew up with. Some say, "Forgive us our trespasses." Others say, "Forgive us our sins." But the oldest versions? They say, "Forgive us our debts." And that one word debt carries a weight most people miss, because it's not just about guilt. It's about imbalance, about something that's owed, something that tilts the scale of the soul. In first-century Judea, debt wasn't just a financial issue, it was a moral one. Entire families were torn apart over unpaid amounts. Land was seized, people were thrown into prison, and many lived in a kind of quiet slavery, not from chains, but from contracts. To be in debt was to be powerless. It was to owe more than you could ever repay. And when Jesus used that word, he wasn't being poetic. He was reaching into the daily agony of the people and offering a way out. But he didn't stop at coins or contracts. The deeper meaning was always spiritual, because in ancient Jewish thinking, sin was often understood as a kind of debt, a failure to uphold a covenant, a disruption in the cosmic order that needed to be made right. So when Jesus said, "Forgive us our debts," He wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about all the ways we fall out of balance, all the burdens we carry, all the things we owe to others, to ourselves, to God. The Greek word used in some manuscripts is ophelemata, a term that referred both to financial obligations and to moral failings. That overlap is no accident. It means the line between money and morality was always thin, but go deeper still, and you'll find a mystical layer. Because in other traditions, especially Eastern ones, this same concept of debt becomes something else entirely. It becomes karma, the unseen residue of actions, good or bad, that shape your path forward, an echo of every choice. So what are you really asking when you pray for forgiveness? You're asking for release, for balance to be restored, for that quiet, aching pressure to finally lift. And you're admitting something few dare say out loud: you can't fix it all yourself. You can't repay it. Not all of it. You need grace. And then comes the second half of the sentence: as we forgive our debtors. A mirror, a warning, a promise. Because forgiveness isn't a gift you keep, it's one you pass on. You're not just asking to be freed, you're agreeing to let others go too. Debt, sin, karma. The word may change, but the ache beneath it doesn't. And the answer? It always begins with mercy. It sounds strange when you really think about it. Lead us not into temptation. Why would a loving God lead anyone into something harmful? Why would Jesus teach people to pray that way? Unless the word didn't mean what you think it means. Unless it wasn't just about avoiding sin, but about surviving something sacred. In the original Greek, the word translated as temptation is perasmos. And yes, it can mean enticement, allure. But more often, it means trial, test. The kind of moment that reveals what's hidden inside you, not to shame you, but to shape you, to burn away the surface and expose the truth underneath. In the ancient world, before someone was crowned, they were tested. Before someone could teach, they were broken open. Even Jesus himself was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to face hunger, isolation, and shadow. That wasn't punishment. That was preparation. There's a long tradition, older than Scripture, where divine encounters begin with trials. You don't just get handed power. You pass through fire. You descend into the cave. You wrestle the angel. You fast for 40 days in a wasteland and come back changed. That's initiation. Not because God wants to see you suffer, but because transformation costs something. So maybe when Jesus said, "Lead us not into temptation," he was offering something more than a plea to avoid sin. Maybe he was giving us words to whisper in the dark when the storm begins to gather. Maybe he was teaching us how to ask for mercy when we're not sure we're strong enough for what's coming, because there are trials we are meant to face. And there are some that would destroy us if we faced them too soon. It's not a prayer of fear. It's a prayer of timing, of trust, of surrender. Do not lead me into the fire unless I am ready to withstand the heat. Do not open the door unless my spirit is prepared to walk through it. Do not let me confuse destruction for growth or collapse for wisdom. This line in the prayer is not weak. It's one of the strongest things you can say. Because the real temptation isn't always lust or greed or lies. Sometimes the temptation is to give up, to stay asleep, to choose comfort over calling. And sometimes the most dangerous trial is the one that looks like success. So when you pray those words, remember they're not just asking for protection, they're asking for preparation, for the strength to endure only the trials that are truly yours to carry, and nothing more. Jesus never said it in English. Not one word of the Lord's Prayer came from his mouth in the language most of us now recite it in. He spoke in Aramaic, a language thick with imagery, rhythm, and double meaning. The kind of language where one word could hold 3 truths at once, and a simple phrase could open like a flower depending on how you heard it. But that Aramaic version, it's gone. lost to time. What we have instead is a translation of a translation. And in that journey from Aramaic to Greek to Latin to English, something subtle and maybe sacred got scrambled. Take daily bread. The original Aramaic word might have meant essential or future or even spiritual, but when it hit Greek, the translators chose a strange word that no one had seen before. Then Latin tried to match it. Then English tried to catch up. And now, centuries later, we're praying for bread when Jesus might have been speaking of breath, or awakening, or revelation, or consider the word temptation. In Aramaic, it may have meant testing or refinement, not moral failure. In English, it sounds like chocolate, or something forbidden behind a locked door. But Jesus was likely referencing the wilderness, the fire, the inner trial every soul must face on the road to becoming whole. And debts? That word was likely chosen by Matthew's Gospel to resonate with Jewish listeners who understood sin as a form of spiritual debt. But Luke, writing to a different audience, uses a word that's more like failures, somewhere between obligation and mistake. And then translators had to pick one. But language is not just about meaning, it's about power. When the Roman Church took hold of the text in Latin, the Lord's Prayer became formal, stiff, grand. It was written to be recited in cathedrals, not whispered in dark corners of grief or wonder. By the time it reached the King James Version in 17th century England, it had become beautiful but also fossilized. We stopped wrestling with it. We started repeating it. The tragedy is not that we translated the prayer. Translation is inevitable. The tragedy is that we stopped asking what it meant. We treated it like a spell, a script. But Jesus never gave it to impress. He gave it to awaken. To hear the prayer as he spoke it, you have to go backward, not in language, but in spirit. You have to strip away the marble and gold and find the voice of a wandering teacher, speaking to poor men and broken women, teaching them to speak with the Creator like children do with breath, with longing, and with fire. And what he said? We've been guessing ever since. There's a version of the Lord's Prayer that almost no one talks about. It comes not from Latin, not from Greek, but from Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, the language closest to what Jesus would have actually spoken. It's called the Peshitta. And what it reveals is not just a different translation, it's a different spirit entirely. Softer, wilder, more cosmic, less courtroom and more sunrise. In the Peshitta version, the opening line doesn't say, "Our Father who art in heaven." It says, "Abwin de Boashmaya." That first word, Abwin, is tender, intimate. It doesn't just mean father. It carries the warmth of beloved parent, or even birther of the cosmos. It's not the voice of a king on a throne. It's the voice that first called stars into being, that held you before you had bones. Then there's the line about the name. Hallowed be thy name becomes something closer to, let your name shine within us. Not distant worship, not fear, but light blooming from the inside out. In this version, holiness is not something you kneel before, it's something that lives in you, waiting to be awakened. And when it gets to thy kingdom come, it doesn't point to the future. It says, let your reign come now, not in the sky, not at the end of days, but now. Through breath, through action, through the simple courage of living as if heaven is already touching earth. Even the infamous daily bread becomes something different in the Peshitta. The phrase can be read as, give us today the bread of the coming day. Not food for this moment, but sustenance drawn from the next world, from the world that is arriving, manna from the future. As if the soul is already hungry for what's just beyond the veil. And when it comes to forgiveness, the prayer doesn't talk about debts. It says, loose the cords of mistakes binding us. That's not accounting language. That's healing language. It's not about erasing a record. It's about untangling, unknotting, becoming free. Temptation? Do not let us be lost in superficial things. That's different, isn't it? Not a test from God, but a warning about the noise of the world, the distractions that drown the soul. And the final plea, deliver us from evil, the Peshitta says, free us from what holds us back. It's not fear-based, it's liberating. This version of the prayer isn't just a translation. It's a return to a voice that sang before dogma, to a rhythm that breathes rather than recites. And maybe, just maybe, it's closer to what Jesus actually meant. Not law, not ritual, but revolution carried on the wind. When the words of Jesus passed through Greek, they changed. Not maliciously, not even deliberately. But something happened like pouring fire into a different-shaped vessel. You still have the light, yes, but the way it moves, shifts. And so the Aramaic rhythms of Jesus, earthy and mystical, were stretched across the grid of Koine Greek, the language of commerce and empire, logic and law. It was the language of Plato, of contracts, of cause and effect. Not the language of desert dreams. Koine Greek was chosen not because it was sacred, but because it was useful. It was the global tongue of the Eastern Roman Empire, a translator's dream. You could reach the cities, the ports, the world. But in that efficiency, something slipped. Aramaic was full of poetic idioms, phrases that danced, that hummed with mystery. Greek needed things to be exact, categorical, and so the translator had to choose, interpret the spirit, or define the sentence. Take that strange word daily in daily bread. In Aramaic, it might have meant essential or coming, but Greek had no perfect match, so the translators made one up, epiousios, a word found nowhere else in Greek literature. No precedent, just an attempt to hold the untranslatable. And theologians have been debating its meaning ever since. Or consider the phrase, lead us not into temptation. In Aramaic, it likely implied, do not let us enter the trial unprepared, a spiritual preparation, a guarding of the soul. But Greek rendered it eisen and case, which sounds like God is the one dragging you toward harm. That changes the character of the divine. Subtly, sharply, even forgive us our debts comes from a Greek decision. The word aphilemata was chosen, meaning literal obligations. But was Jesus talking about money? About sin? About the tangled knots of human failure? Aramaic could have carried all three at once. Greek had to pick a lane, and so theology was born not from pure revelation, but from linguistic necessity. This isn't to say Greek was wrong. It carried the message forward. It protected it, expanded it, made it readable to millions. But it also framed Jesus through the lens of dualism. Heaven above, earth below. Soul versus body. Saved or damned. All of which feel far more Greek than Hebrew. Jesus was not speaking in binaries. He was speaking in parables. He was whispering metaphors that opened slowly, like desert flowers. But through Greek, mystery became doctrine, poetry became creed. And the voice that once spoke to fishermen and farmers was now echoing in marble halls. Still, if you listen closely beneath the layers, you can hear it. The original voice, the Semitic pulse, the desert breath, and it's still calling. When St. Jerome sat down to translate the scriptures into Latin in the 4th century, he wasn't just copying words, he was shaping the voice of God for the Western world. His version, the Latin Vulgate, would become the official Bible of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. But in that great and heavy task, even the smallest word choice could echo through history like a bell. And one word in particular daily has never quite rung the same since. The Greek Gospel used a strange word in the Lord's Prayer, epiousios. No one really knew what it meant. It's a ghost word, found nowhere else in all of ancient Greek, not in the poets, not in the philosophers. It appeared only in this prayer. Scholars have puzzled over it for centuries. Some thought it meant necessary, others thought it meant for tomorrow. Something essential, yes, but something mysterious. something just out of reach. But Jerome had to choose. He was translating the Greek into Latin, trying to be faithful, trying to make sense of it, and so he chose quotidianum, which means daily, ordinary, repeating, familiar. A loaf on the table, a habit, a routine, and just like that, the mystical was made mundane. It's not that Jerome was wrong, but he may have simplified something that was never meant to be simple. The Aramaic Jesus likely spoke could have carried shades of sustenance, breath, revelation, or even future hope. It may have meant not just bread for the body, but food for the soul, nourishment from the realm of the divine, manna that falls from beyond the veil. But quotidianum stripped that away. It made the prayer feel like a grocery list. Give us our daily bread, provide our physical needs. Check. Move on. And for generations, that's how the line was taught. Something material, something plain. But what if the original line was never about crust and crumbs? What if it was about the deeper hunger, the ache to be fed by something eternal? That word choice, made by a man trying his best in a candlelit room over 1,500 years ago, shaped how millions would understand the prayer, how monks would chant it, how priests would preach it, how children would memorize it. One word, and yet, underneath the Latin, beneath the Greek, buried in the lost cadence of Aramaic, the mystery still stirs. It was never just about bread. It was about the thing that keeps you going when there's no bread left at all. It slips past your lips without a second thought. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. But what if those three little letters, thy, carry more than just old-fashioned elegance? What if that word is the doorway into how you see God, and how you think God sees you? When we hear thy, we assume it's just sacred language, King James style, thees and thous, something formal, something holy. But in truth, in early English, thy wasn't formal at all. It was intimate. The language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible still remembered the old rules. Thou was used for friends, for lovers, for equals, even for children. You was the distant one, the formal one, the language you used for lords, for strangers, or someone above your station. So when English translators chose to use thy in the Lord's Prayer, they weren't elevating the speech, they were pulling it closer. They were saying, speak to God like a child speaks to a parent, not groveling, not afraid, with closeness, with tenderness, with trust. But centuries passed, and the meanings reversed. Thou began to sound lofty, thy began to sound royal. The prayer began to feel like something you had to recite in a cathedral, not whisper on a sleepless night. The language of intimacy turned, slowly, into the language of distance. And so we lost something. The original Aramaic Jesus spoke didn't have this problem. It was naturally close. It was earthy and familiar. His words weren't dressed up for ceremony. They came from the dust and the fire, from kitchens and fishing boats. When he prayed Abun, he wasn't bowing to a throne. He was calling to the source. The same source, he said, lives within you. So when you say thy, stop for a moment and feel it. Let it pull you out of the performance and back into relationship. This isn't a courtroom plea. It's not a letter to a distant monarch. It's the voice of someone who knows they are already loved. There's power in that. Not the kind that dominates, but the kind that transforms. The kind that dares to speak plainly to the infinite and believes the infinite listens. Not you, O far-off deity. Thy, yours, mine, ours. That's not formality. That's home. You've heard it 1,000 times. Our Father, who art in heaven. And maybe you never paused on that word art. It sounds old, reverent, maybe poetic, like something carved into stained glass or echoed in stone chapels. But in the original language of Jesus, there was no such word. He wasn't trying to sound ancient. He wasn't trying to sound holy. He was simply speaking from the heart. In early modern English, art was just the second-person form of to be. Nothing mystical, nothing grand, just grammar. Thou art meant you are. That's all. So when King James's scholars translated the prayer in the early 17th century, who art in heaven was their way of saying who is in heaven. But language moved on, and what once felt normal began to feel distant. Now it sounds like a spell. But Jesus wasn't casting a spell. When he said who is in heaven, the word heaven didn't mean what it means to most people now. It didn't mean a fluffy cloud realm far away. It meant the skies, yes, but also the unseen, the layered, the everywhere. In Aramaic, Bashmaya in the heavens was not a place, but a state, a condition of divine presence, not far, not unreachable, surrounding, infusing, closer than breath. So put it back together. Our Father who is in the heavens, not a God sitting above the clouds watching like a king with a telescope, but a source who is in the very fabric of things, in light, in air, in thought, in love, in the structure behind reality. But once the word art started sounding fancy, everything around it started sounding fancy too. And soon, instead of being the cry of a soul reaching out in intimacy, the prayer became performance. We stopped realizing that Jesus was telling us to speak to a Father who is not somewhere else but who is, right now, in the invisible space between everything. In heaven. Yes, but heaven is here too. So when you say who art in heaven, try this instead. Hear it as you are present in the vastness and in the stillness. Hear it as you are not gone, you are woven into all things. Hear it as you are, not distant, not silent, not waiting, just being. And that's where the prayer begins, not in fear or formality, but in presence, in the realization that the one you're speaking to is already here. There is a word in the Lord's Prayer that has baffled scholars for centuries. It is hidden in plain sight, nestled inside a line you've probably recited hundreds of times without question. Give us this day our daily bread. Simple enough, right? Except the word translated as daily epiousios is a mystery, a ghost word. It appears nowhere else in the entire Greek language. Not in any other ancient manuscript, not in poems, not in legal texts, not in plays, just here, just once. No one knows exactly what it means. That's not poetic exaggeration. That is a linguistic fact. Even the earliest Greek commentators, just a few generations after the Gospel writers, were scratching their heads. Origen, one of the early church fathers, admitted openly, "We don't know what this word means." And yet it made its way into the most repeated prayer in all of Christendom. The word epiousios is made up of two parts, epi, which means upon or for, and osios, related to ousia, meaning essence or substance. So the prayer might be asking for the bread of essence, or the bread that is necessary for being. Some thought it meant tomorrow's bread, a kind of futuristic sustenance. Others believed it referred to a spiritual nourishment, not physical at all. Something more like manna. Something not baked, but given. When St. Jerome translated the Gospels into Latin in the 4th century, he had to make a decision. What do you do with a word that doesn't exist anywhere else? He chose supersubstantialem, supersubstantial bread, bread that is beyond substance, a mystical term, almost alchemical. But in other places, the Latin version simply said daily bread, because the mystery was too difficult to explain, too strange, too shimmering. And so over the centuries, epiousios quietly faded behind the curtain of tradition. The English-speaking world adopted daily, and the prayer became about routine needs, breakfast, survival, simplicity. But what if that word wasn't simple at all? What if Jesus, choosing his words with deliberate precision, placed a linguistic key in the middle of the prayer, a key meant to point to something transcendent, something you cannot grow, cannot buy, something that must be received, the bread of being, the substance of the soul, the nourishment that comes not from the world, but from the invisible current that holds the world together. Maybe epousios was never meant to be fully defined. Maybe it was meant to awaken something in the hearer, a hunger not for food, but for meaning, for presence, for God. And maybe the real miracle is that the strangest word in the prayer is the one that tells you what to truly ask for. Forgiveness, as we imagine it today, often feels like something personal, emotional, even spiritual. But in the ancient world, especially in the economies of Mesopotamia and the cultures that shaped early biblical language, forgiveness was far more practical. It was a financial term, a commercial act. It was something you could weigh, count, and record on clay tablets. And if you didn't understand that, you might miss the deeper meaning behind the words, "Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors." In Sumerian and Babylonian city-states, kings would occasionally declare a debt amnesty. Whole ledgers would be wiped clean, loans erased, land returned, slaves set free. These weren't just random acts of mercy, they were tools to reset society when it began to crumble under the weight of inequality. Farmers trapped by drought, laborers crushed by taxes, families divided by bondage. All of it could be undone in a royal proclamation called Andurarum or Misharum, Jubilee. It was less about moral guilt and more about balance, harmony, justice. The Hebrew tradition absorbed this economic spiritual rhythm. Every 7 years, debts were to be released. Every 50, a great Jubilee year restored land and liberty. So when Jesus said, "Forgive us our debts," he wasn't just speaking metaphorically. He was referencing a real cultural practice, a social and divine rebalancing act. The Aramaic word, often translated as debt, also meant sin or obligation. To forgive was to untie the knot, to release the grip, to open the cage, and it went both ways. That's the radical edge in "as we forgive our debtors." Not just "God, please have mercy on me," but "God, do to me what I'm doing to others." That's dangerous, that's vulnerable, that's holy. And in the ancient Near East, it echoed the very structure of the cosmos. The king forgives the people forgive each other, and in doing so, they align with the divine rhythm. Mercy isn't optional, it's structural. So when you pray that line, you are not just whispering a hope for personal peace. You are participating in a system of release. You are declaring an end to the economy of punishment. You are saying, "I will not trap others in the weight of what they owe me. And I ask not to be trapped either." You are becoming the amnesty. And maybe that is the greatest miracle of all, that forgiveness is not weakness, but justice, not softness, but strength, a divine interruption in the endless math of revenge, not just spiritual poetry, economic revolution, disguised as a prayer. When you reach the end of the Lord's Prayer, your voice may soften. "Deliver us from evil." It sounds like a final plea, a shield against darkness. But what if that word evil does not mean what you think it means? What if it's not about personal sin, not about failing a test of morality, but about something far older and far more alive? In Greek, the word used is poneru, a strange word. It can mean evil in a general sense, yes, but it also points towards something much sharper, more personal. Many ancient scholars argued it should be translated not as evil, but as the evil one, a being, a force, a will. Not abstract badness, but a conscious adversary, a presence with intent. The Aramaic language that Jesus spoke carried similar meanings. It didn't separate evil from reality, it wove it into the world as something you could encounter, something that moved through systems, through powers, through fears. Not just in individuals, but in the air, in the structures, in the hidden places where decisions get made. So when Jesus said, "Deliver us from evil," he wasn't saying, "Keep me from being naughty." He was saying, "Rescue us from the grip of what wants to devour us." He was naming the weight that crushes the poor, the whisper that twists the truth, the cold pull toward despair, or war, or injustice, the thing behind the things. And the word deliver rusai in Greek means more than help. It means snatch away, tear free, rescue by force. It's not passive, it's violent in the best way. It imagines God as the hand that breaks through the darkness and pulls you out. This isn't a line for polite prayers. This is a survival cry. And still, there's more. Because the evil Jesus spoke of may not always be outside of you. It might also be what grows within the inner saboteur, the silent voice that says, "You are alone, you are doomed, you are nothing." Sometimes the thing to be delivered from is not someone else's war, but the one being waged inside your own heart. So the prayer becomes a declaration, not just a wish, not just a line to memorize, but a call to the divine. Break the grip, shatter the lie, pull me back to the light. Deliver us from evil, not because we're weak, but because we're ready to stop pretending we can do it alone. You probably know how it ends. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. It rolls off the tongue like the closing chords of a hymn, but what if I told you that ending wasn't there at all? The earliest manuscripts of the Gospels do not include it. Not in Matthew, not in Luke, not in the oldest scraps of papyrus that scholars have held in white-gloved hands, brushing dust from the words written in ancient ink. The Lord's Prayer, as preserved in those earliest texts, ends abruptly. Deliver us from evil. Full stop. No flourish. No doxology. No kingdom or glory. Just the silence after the cry. So where did it come from? The answer, as always, is complicated and beautiful. Early Christian communities, especially in the Eastern traditions, were used to ending prayers with doxologies, little bursts of praise. In Jewish tradition, prayers often concluded by returning focus to the sovereignty of God. So it may have felt strange to leave the Lord's Prayer on a note of darkness. Deliver us from evil without a final uplift. Somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries, scribes and liturgical leaders began adding what felt missing, not to change the meaning, but to complete the rhythm, to return the heart back to hope. By the time the King James Bible was translated in the early 17th century, that ending had already become part of common Christian worship, so the translators included it. Even though the oldest manuscripts they had access to didn't contain it, they weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were honoring tradition, a living prayer. But now, with access to even earlier texts, we know the doxology was an addition, a liturgical echo layered on later. Some scholars think it may have come from a document called the Didache, a 1st-century Christian teaching manual, where a version of the Lord's Prayer ends with a doxology quite similar to what we say today. So is it wrong to include it? That depends on what you believe prayer really island. If prayer is a magical formula, every word counted, every syllable sacred, then maybe additions should worry you. But if prayer is a conversation, a living rhythm between the human and the divine, then maybe this ending is exactly what it was always meant to be. A final bow, a circle drawn in the sand, a reminder that even after asking for rescue from darkness, we return to the truth. The kingdom is not Rome, the power is not ours. The glory is not temporary, and the prayer, like breath, begins again. At first glance, the Lord's Prayer seems simple, direct, earthy. But beneath its words, layered like folds in sacred parchment, lie patterns that whisper something deeper, something ancient. For those who've studied Kabbalah, the mystical tradition of Jewish thought, the structure of the prayer doesn't just guide you to speak to God. It mirrors the very way the divine flows through reality. In Kabbalah, there are 10 emanations called Sephirot, through which the infinite reveals itself. They are not places, they are not gods, they are qualities, currents, pathways that descend from pure spirit into the fabric of matter. From Keter, the crown of divine will, all the way to Malkuth, the kingdom where spirit takes form. Now listen to the prayer again, not with your ears but with your inner map. Our Father, who art in heaven. That's Keter, the divine source, beyond comprehension, but present as origin. Hallowed be thy name. That's Chokmah and Binah, wisdom and understanding. The name, sacred and unspoken, begins to pour into form. Thy kingdom come, Malkuth, the divine taking root in the world, not in abstraction, but in dust and time. And then, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's Tiferet, the balancing beauty, where divine compassion merges with justice, the heart of the tree of life. Even the phrase, "Give us this day our daily bread," in its deepest mystical reading is not about physical bread at all. It is Shefa, the divine flow. It is Yesod, the foundation where higher energies channel into sustenance for the soul. Not food, but manna, wisdom, breath. The petition for forgiveness echoes Hod and Netzach, humility and endurance. The place where karma untangles, and the soul learns to bow without breaking. And finally, the plea for deliverance touches the deepest root of the tree. Malkuth again, the world made holy. The darkness confronted not by fleeing it but by bringing light into it. This isn't a coincidence. The early followers of Jesus were deeply shaped by Jewish mystical thought, even if they did not call it Kabbalah yet. They understood that prayer wasn't just something you said. It was a ladder, a map, a temple built out of syllables, and the Lord's Prayer may be the most perfect miniature temple ever constructed. You don't need to understand Kabbalah to feel it, but once you see it, you'll never hear those words the same way again, because they are not just words. They are a path through the 10 gates of creation, spoken aloud by millions, whispered in every tongue, and yet, hiding this structure the whole time, like breath beneath a song. Close your eyes and speak it slowly, not as a recitation, but as a rhythm, a current, a sacred alignment. The Lord's Prayer, long thought of as a formula for the soul, may also be something else entirely, a map of the body's hidden light, because there are 7 core petitions in the prayer, and there are 7 chakras. Coincidence or design? The first line opens from the crown, "Our Father, who art in heaven." The gateway to the divine, the 1,000-petaled lotus. It is not a place, but a state of consciousness that knows it is not alone. To speak of the Father in heaven is to remember that you are connected to something vast and eternal. Hallowed be thy name. This flows down to the third eye, Ajna, the seat of perception, of inner knowing, of vision beyond sight. To hallow a name, to make it sacred, is to see beyond the veil of words. This is not about vocabulary. It is about reverence for the mystery behind the mask. Thy kingdom come. The throat chakra Vishuddha resonates here. The voice, the place of expression, of truth brought forth. To call down the kingdom is to manifest heaven through sound, through declaration, through the raw power of language shaping reality. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. This is the heart Anahata, the bridge between spirit and flesh. To do the will of the divine is not blind obedience. It is heart alignment, compassion meeting courage, the merging of above and below, of mercy and might. Give us this day our daily bread. That is the solar plexus Manipura, the fire center, power, will, digestion, not just of food, but of energy, of responsibility. To receive bread here is to say, I am ready to stand in my power and be sustained. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. This centers in the sacral chakra, Svadhisthana, the place of emotion, intimacy, relationship, forgiveness, lives here, not in the mind, but in the waters of feeling. This line is not theology. It is therapy for the wounded inner child. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This descends to the root, Muladhara, the base, the ground, survival, safety. To ask for deliverance is to return to the beginning, to the place where fear is buried deepest, where evil takes root as trauma, and where trust must be rebuilt. One breath at a time. 7 lines, 7 centers. One flow of light spiraling downward like divine breath, or maybe upward, as your soul rises with each word. The body is not separate from spirit, and the prayer, spoken aloud, may be far more than poetry. It may be activation, an ancient technology, hiding in plain sound, waiting for you to feel it, not just say it. Before there were written words, there was breath. In the beginning, the divine did not write, it spoke, and even before sound took shape into syllables, there was vibration. Air moved, and from that movement came creation. Ancient mystics knew this. Across cultures, breath was never just a biological act. It was a sacred act, a bridge between body and spirit. In Hebrew, the word ruach means both spirit and breath. In Greek, pneuma means the same. And in Aramaic, the language in which Jesus first spoke the Lord's Prayer, the word nishma carries the pulse of life itself. Now read the Lord's Prayer not as a script, but as a breath map. Each line is not merely something to recite, it is something to exhale. Our Father, who art in heaven, breathe in and lift. Feel it at the crown of your head. A pause, a reverence. Hallowed be thy name, release slowly. Whisper it like incense rising. Not shouted, not declared, just honored in air. Thy kingdom come, a firm, grounded breath. Thy will be done, on earth, as it is in heaven. A longer exhale, stretching from sky to soil. Feel the expansion. Your ribs, your chest, your rootedness. Give us this day our daily bread, a soft inhale, the breath of receiving. Daily bread was never just wheat or barley. It was manna, wisdom, spirit sustenance, and spirit is breath. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. This is where the breath catches. The hardest line, the one that sticks in the throat. The line where the inhale tightens and the exhale releases what you've been gripping. A breath of surrender, a breath of letting go. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The breath becomes protective, a shield, a barrier of air, not frantic, not panicked, but intentional. A breath you draw when standing at the edge of something dark. And finally, for thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory. A rising breath, ascending. The exhale lifts, and the body feels it, like a wind through the branches of the soul. What if the Lord's Prayer was never meant to be spoken quickly? What if its power isn't just in the meaning of the words, but in the breath that carries them? Each line as a sacred rhythm, each pause as holy as the syllables themselves. Mystics say God is not in the thunder, but in the stillness, not in the noise, but in the breath between it. Prayer is not just what you say, it's what moves through you when you say it. And sometimes, silence is the loudest part. It was never just a prayer. It was a signal, a whisper passed beneath persecution, a code spoken in flickering candlelight or scratched into stone with trembling hands. For early Christians, hunted and hated, faith had to be hidden, and so the Lord's Prayer became more than devotion, it became disguise. Imagine this. A stranger knocks at the door. Inside, a family gathers in silence. The Romans are near. The air is tight with fear. The door opens slowly, and the visitor speaks not their name but a line. Thy kingdom come. No explanation, just breath and syllables. The reply comes softly from within. Thy will be done. It wasn't liturgy. It was recognition. Each line of the prayer held meaning beyond the words. A coded message, a cipher of belonging. Our Father was not just about God, it was about unity. A reminder that we are part of the same body, scattered but connected. Hallowed be thy name was a vow to speak the sacred, even when silence was safer. And thy kingdom come? That was revolution in disguise. It meant, we do not serve Caesar. Our allegiance is to another reign. When early followers met in the catacombs or beneath markets, they couldn't carry scrolls. They carried memory. The prayer was short enough to memorize, yet deep enough to encode their entire worldview. Its phrasing was layered, fluid, spoken carefully to identify friend from threat, like a fisherman's password, like a rebel's knock. But it was more than protection. It was a blueprint. Give us this day our daily bread. A secret way of saying, we take care of one another. We share what we have. Forgive us our debts, not just spiritual language but communal ethics. If one member suffered, all did. Forgiveness wasn't charity, it was survival. And the final line, sometimes whispered only at the end of a meeting. For thine is the kingdom, and the power and the glory wasn't always spoken aloud. Sometimes it was traced in dust, sometimes just mouthed in silence. It was the closing of the lock, the return to secrecy. This prayer has circled the globe for centuries, spoken in cathedrals, chanted in ruins, carved into headstones. But before it became common, it was code. Before it was printed, it was protected. And behind its poetic rhythm lies a memory, a network of people who risked everything just to say it out loud. It was never just about heaven. It was about each other. And in the shadows of empires, it was how they knew they were not alone. Before Jesus ever walked the dusty roads of Galilee, there was Enoch, the seventh from Adam, the man who walked with God and vanished, not because he died, but because he was taken. And buried within the ancient book of Enoch, long lost, then rediscovered in Ethiopia centuries later, are words that echo uncannily through the Lord's Prayer. Not in exact phrasing, but in spirit, in longing, in urgency. The book of Enoch is a cry for justice, a call for the divine to intervene in a world poisoned by the fallen, where angels defied their place and passed forbidden knowledge to mankind. It speaks of watchers, of giants, of a corrupted earth pleading for purification. And again, Enoch prays not just for comfort but for a kingdom, a reckoning, a new world to break into the old. Sound familiar? When the Lord's Prayer says, thy kingdom come, it is not a sweet wish. It is a battle cry, a coded plea for the holy to confront the unholy. In the book of Enoch, the righteous beg for God's kingdom to be established, for evil to be judged, for the wicked to no longer prosper, while the just suffer. This is not passive waiting. It is desperate invocation. Deliver us from evil. That line, too, feels older than it seems. In Enoch's visions, evil is not abstract. It is cosmic. It is organized. It is intelligent. The Nephilim, the disobedient angels, the corrupt systems of the world, all must be undone. And the only rescue comes from above, not through political might, not through armies, but through divine correction. Even the structure of the Lord's Prayer mirrors ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature. A world in crisis, a call to the divine, a yearning for sustenance, not just bread, but wisdom, not just forgiveness, but a release from cycles of injustice. And finally, a plea for deliverance from forces unseen and yet all too real. Some early Christian mystics believed Jesus wasn't teaching a new prayer, but summarizing an old cry, a distilled echo of Enoch, a bridge between ancient watchers and the new kingdom, between heaven opened once and heaven still to come. So when you say the Lord's Prayer, you're not just praying the words of a rabbi. You're picking up a thread thousands of years long, a thread that winds through deserts and scrolls, through dreams and visions. And if you listen closely, in the silence between the lines. You just might hear Enoch still whispering. Not gone, just taken, still watching, still waiting. The caves at Qumran were silent for nearly 2,000 years. Then, in the mid-20th century, the desert broke its silence. Hidden in jars, wrapped in linen, buried beneath dust and time, the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged, fragments of forgotten prayers, lost psalms, ancient laws, and prophetic fire. And tucked among them, like soft echoes of something oddly familiar, were words that seemed to mirror what billions now recite without question. The Lord's Prayer didn't fall from the sky whole. It rose from the soil of a troubled land, a place torn between empires, weighed down by longing, and pierced with a desperate hope for divine intervention. And the Qumran community, those strange, secluded Essenes, prayed with the same ache. Their texts plead for God's kingdom to be revealed, for His will to triumph on earth, for sustenance to be granted, for sins to be forgiven, for evil to be banished. Sound familiar? One scroll fragment speaks of bread for today and tomorrow, a striking phrase reminiscent of the Greek word epiousios, that haunting, once used word translated as daily in the Lord's Prayer. Another scroll, a communal blessing, calls on God's name to be made holy among the righteous. An invocation that feels like a cousin to hallowed be thy name. Over and over, in fragment after fragment, the same petitions reappear, structured differently, but pulsing with the same soul. These weren't casual prayers. They were apocalyptic, urgent, loaded with the belief that the world was about to turn, and heaven's justice would finally invade earth's corruption. The Qumran sect believed they were the final remnant, that the time was near, that their words were part of a great cosmic battle being waged through prayer, fasting, and purity. Jesus, too, stood at the edge of an age, and whether he borrowed, rephrased, or divinely aligned, his famous prayer stands in eerie resonance with theirs. Same longing, same language, same layered codes. This doesn't lessen the prayer's power. It deepens it. It roots it. It shows us that the words we mouth today are not simply formulaic. They are fossilized longing, embedded with the cries of desert mystics and hill country rebels. They are not new. They are eternal. And perhaps that's the point. The Lord's Prayer is not an invention, it's an echo of scrolls crumbling in the dry Judean air, an echo of voices who watched the stars and waited for the sky to open, an echo of a people who believed their words could shake the world. And maybe, just maybe, they did. You've been told it's a prayer. Simple, familiar, reassuring. But what if it was never meant to be safe? What if the Lord's Prayer is not just a liturgical formula, but a portal, a sequence of sound and breath designed to change your state of consciousness? Ancient mystics across traditions believed words had power, not metaphorical power, but vibrational power. The right phrase, spoken with the right breath, in the right rhythm, could shift the body, open the mind, thin the veil. Kabbalists chanted names of God for hours. Desert fathers sat in caves and repeated lines until the world dissolved. Sufis spun, yogis hummed, and followers of Jesus, they prayed this. Consider this. The Aramaic language Jesus spoke was dense with layered meanings. One word could mean breath, spirit, wind, and presence all at once. Saying Abwunda Bashmaya wasn't just calling a father in heaven, it was drawing the divine breath down through the body. Each phrase of the prayer moves like a wave, calling in, anchoring, releasing. It is not just a list of requests, it is a guided ascent and descent, a mystical pattern etched into the soul. Look closely. The beginning reaches upward. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It sets the orientation skyward, sacred, vast. Then the kingdom comes down. Then the will descends. Then it lands on earth. The prayer pulls the divine into the human, the infinite into the present, and just when it reaches the ground, It shifts. Daily bread, forgiveness, protection, deliverance, a spiral inward, like a breath cycle, like a mantra spiral, like an invocation unlocking each level of being. And here's where it gets stranger. Early Christian mystics, people later labeled heretics, believed that repeated, meditative prayer could open the nous, the eye of the heart, a doorway into direct communion. They didn't want to just believe in God. They wanted to see. The Lord's Prayer wasn't recited, it was entered. It wasn't spoken to a being far away. It was used to become something else, something attuned, something awake. What if this prayer is a code? Not to manipulate, but to remember, to awaken a state of being in which the divine and the human are no longer separate things. What if the rhythm, the breath, tone, is the key, not a spell, not a trick, a portal, and every time you whisper it, the door cracks open just a little wider. They called it the prayer of fire. In the silence of caves and sun-bleached deserts, early Christian monks known as the Desert Fathers did not simply say the Lord's Prayer. They chanted it, repeated it, let it echo through their bones. This was not ceremony. This was survival. These men were not cloistered theologians debating ideas in safety. They had fled the cities and comforts of Roman life to confront something most people spent their lives avoiding: the raw, wild self. The mind untamed, the body unbuffered, the soul exposed. Alone in the desert, their only weapon was breath, and the Lord's Prayer became their shield. Accounts from these ancient ascetics describe spiritual warfare not as metaphor, but as lived experience. They spoke of voices whispering in the dark, visions of temptation, the weight of despair pressing down like stone. But when they began the prayer, "Our Father, who art in heaven," the atmosphere would shift, the voices would scatter, the air would lighten. Not because the words were magic, but because the words reminded them who they were. They were not abandoned, they were not broken, they were not alone. Some said they saw shadows flee at the sound of "Deliver us from evil." Others claimed the repetition itself, chanted for hours, brought on altered states, lucid dreams, inner lights, deep peace that burned like a fire in the belly. These were not hallucinations, they insisted. These were visitations. The prayer was not a plea. It was a confrontation. It was a claiming of space. A declaration that heaven was not distant, it was descending. By the time of the 4th century, this practice had become widespread. The Lord's Prayer wasn't said once before bed, it was whispered dozens of times each hour, coordinated with breathing. Inhale, "Thy kingdom come." Exhale, "Thy will be done." Again, and again, and again. Eventually, the monks stopped saying the prayer out loud. They no longer needed to. The rhythm was written into their breath, into their heartbeat. The words were not outside of them anymore. They had become the prayer. And perhaps that was the point all along. The Lord's Prayer was never meant to be a lifeless recital. It was born in a world of dirt and danger, of demons and dust, of people who knew that to survive spiritually, mentally, physically, they had to pray with everything they had, not with fear, but with authority. So when the monks whispered those ancient words into the howling wind, they weren't asking for safety. They were declaring war. They thought it was just a prayer. But hidden in its structure, beneath the words millions recite without thinking, there lies a pattern. Not a random one, a sacred one. The kind that shows up in nature, in ancient temples, in spiral galaxies, and sunflower seeds. The kind that whispers, "This was designed." When scholars and mystics began breaking down the Lord's Prayer by syllable, something strange emerged. No matter the language, when phrased in its original cadence and flow, the rhythm often landed near golden ratios, Fibonacci spirals, symmetries that echo throughout sacred architecture. 7 petitions, 3 opening lines, 1 mirrored center, and phrases that fold over one another like fractals. revealing new shapes the longer you stare. This isn't numerology fluff. Even conservative theologians admit that the prayer is crafted with extreme precision, more poetry than prose. The balance between invocation, petition, and praise feels intentional. There's a harmonic progression, a tension, and release, like music composed for something bigger than ears. In Greek, the word counts form patterns of 7 and 14. In Aramaic, vowel clusters align with breath lengths associated with traditional chant. And in modern English, if spoken slowly and rhythmically, the prayer naturally settles into 4-beat phrases just like ancient Hebrew psalms. Sacred geometry isn't just in shapes. It's in time, in pulse, in voice. But here's where it gets stranger. Some researchers, especially those trained in Kabbalistic tradition, believe that the Lord's Prayer, when written out and diagrammed, fits neatly into the tree of life. Each line lands on a sephira. Each petition flows downward, from crown to kingdom. It's not just a spiritual progression, it's a map, a descent, a return. And if you overlay the phrasing onto a mandala, something clicks. The center holds the sacred name. Around it, will, bread, forgiveness, protection. The shape breathes, a divine symmetry revealing itself to the still and attentive. Did the carpenter from Galilee know what he was doing? Did he weave the universe's fingerprints into a few lines of spoken prayer? Or did he just listen closely enough to speak with the same rhythm the stars were already humming? Because maybe that's what prayer really island. Not begging, not performing, but tuning. Tuning your breath, your mind, your will, to the deeper pattern beneath all things. The geometry of grace, the symmetry of surrender, the spiral of spirit reaching back toward its source. And maybe that's why, after all these centuries, people still feel something when they say it, even if they don't know why. Somewhere deep in their bones, the pattern remembers. They weren't reciting it, they were climbing it. To the mystics, the Lord's Prayer was not a rote obligation before sleep or supper. It was a ladder, a map, a secret ascent. Saints and visionaries across centuries didn't just say the words. They stepped into them. Each phrase became a rung, lifting them higher into the unseeable. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who painted sound into color and saw God in swirling fire wheels, believed prayer was vibrational. Her visions weren't vague hallucinations, they came as structured revelations, symphonic patterns of breath and word. She called the sacred names living lights. When she prayed, "Thy will be done," she claimed to feel the divine current pulling through her body like a river. The Lord's Prayer, she said, wasn't just communication. It was resonance with the divine architecture of the cosmos. Teresa of Avila, centuries later, went deeper still. Her interior castle described 7 stages of the soul's journey inward, each room more radiant, more difficult to survive. At the center, union, flame. A silence so full it shattered her sense of time. She taught that even the simplest prayer, if repeated with true attention, could unlock the gates of that castle. Especially this one. She would meditate line by line, not rushing, sometimes spending an hour just on Our Father, sometimes weeping before even reaching Give us this day. To her, each line contained a universe, and she wasn't alone in that. The Desert Fathers spoke of reciting the prayer as protection against not just spiritual darkness, but literal attacks, visions in the night, shadows that whispered. John Climacus, the monk who authored The Ladder of Divine Ascent, wrote that some prayers are spoken upward, but others, like this one, are received downward, not said to reach heaven, but given from it. Even the hesychasts of Mount Athos, secluded in their silent towers by the Aegean Sea, whispered fragments of the prayer with each breath, aligning inhale with Our Father and exhale with Who art in heaven. They weren't trying to think. They were trying to disappear, to dissolve the self into the words until only the prayer remained. These mystics were not naive. They battled doubt, despair, and the terrifying silence of divine absence. But they returned again and again to these words, not for comfort, not for theology, but because, in the end, they believed the prayer was not about God, it was with God, a joining, a path hidden in plain sight, and if you knew how to walk it, barefoot and broken-hearted, it could take you farther than any sermon ever could. Upward, inward, home. It doesn't begin with Our Father. It begins with a breath. O birther, Father, Mother of the cosmos. That's how one version starts the Aramaic version. The version whispered in caves, not cathedrals. The version passed through hands that feared the sword more than the scribe. And it changes everything. This isn't the patriarchal father seated on a throne above the clouds. This is something more primal, more intimate. A force, not a figure. Not the bearded lawgiver of Renaissance art, but the very womb of existence birthing galaxies, breath, and blood in one sacred motion. To the ancients who spoke Aramaic, words were not labels, they were living forces. To speak them was to activate them. The word for father in Aramaic abun is not gendered in the way we think. It blends Abba, the intimate papa, with womb and source. It means the origin of movement, vibration, creation itself, not male, not female, divine unity. That first line alone dismantles centuries of hierarchy, and that's just the beginning. Hallowed be thy name becomes, focus your light within us, make it useful. Instead of glorifying a distant deity, the prayer turns inward. It asks for activation for the sacred name, the divine code, to burn within the bones and stir action in the world. Thy kingdom come becomes create your reign of unity now. Not some far-off heaven, not some post-apocalyptic reward, but right now, on this ground, in these bodies. Give us this day our daily bread becomes give us the food we need to grow through each new day. Not wheat, not barley, but growth, spiritual sustenance, the courage to evolve, and lead us not into temptation becomes do not let us enter forgetfulness. Forgetfulness of who we are, of where we came from, of the flame still glowing quietly behind the eyes. The prayer isn't asking for moral perfection, it's asking for remembrance, and then the most radical part of all, for thine is the kingdom, not there. That ending? A liturgical addition, a closing flourish for the public performance. But in the oldest Aramaic fragments, the prayer doesn't end with a bow, it ends like breath, dissolving back into silence, as if to say, you now finish the prayer with your life. This version was hidden, suppressed, not because it was false, but because it was too true, too personal, too dangerous, because it didn't point to the sky, it pointed inside you, and once you heard it, really heard it, you couldn't unhear it. You weren't just praying to God. You were praying with God. It would not have sounded like Shakespeare. It wouldn't even sound like modern Hebrew. When Yeshua spoke, the words carried the cadence of northern Galilee, thick with rolled consonants, sung more than spoken. To hear him pray would be to hear water over stones, not a sermon but a song half whispered to the wind. Linguists call it Galilean Aramaic. It was the tongue of fishermen and field hands, of carpenters and rebels. It was not the language of empire or priests. The accent was raw, rural, and full of breath, and that breath mattered, because in Aramaic, the rhythm, pitch, and tone weren't just flavor, they were power. When Yeshua said, Abun, it did not land like Our Father. It rose and curled. The first syllable opened the throat, the second vibrated low. To say it right was to feel it in the body. This was not accidental. This was designed. The entire prayer, short, simple, unforgettable, fit the contours of oral transmission. It wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be embodied. And the intonation may have been the secret. Early mystics, especially in desert monastic communities, believed that how you said a word changed what it did. A flat tone could seal a word. A rising tone could open it. And when it came to sacred language, intonation was everything. It was the key that unlocked meaning, not through grammar, but through vibration. So when Yeshua prayed aloud, and he often did, it wasn't just for others to hear. It was to tune himself. The prayer wasn't a message sent up. It was a doorway opened inward. Imagine standing near him in a dusty courtyard, the day slowing, the wind still. He doesn't shout. He doesn't even speak loudly. He begins the prayer like an invocation. And as he says each word, something changes not just in the air, but in the space between people. Time softens. The mind quiets. You feel present, not like an audience, like a witness. Modern translations miss this. They flatten it into syllables and ink. But Yeshua's voice, it was textured, lived in, and more importantly, it was musical. The prayer was not an instruction. It was a frequency, and that may be what we've forgotten, that this was never meant to be just spoken. It was meant to resonate. He told them to go into their room, to shut the door, to pray where no one could hear, not on the street corners, not in the synagogues, not for show, in secret. That was the rule. So why, then, has the most repeated prayer in the world become the most public? Why would the man who taught silence and solitude offer a prayer that would echo through stadiums, cathedrals, battlefields, weddings, funerals, television, and parliaments? Because it was never about the words, it was about remembrance. The line is clear, recorded in the same chapter. When you pray, do not babble like the pagans do, but go into your inner room, not just a physical room, but a chamber of the soul, a place untouched by applause or comparison. And in that stillness, he gives them a form, not a performance, a pattern. The Lord's Prayer was not a public script. It was a spiritual spine, something to align you inwardly, not parade outwardly. Each phrase was a mirror, each line a compass. It was meant to guide you, not entertain others. And yet, by the 2nd century, it was already being recited communally. By the 4th, it was formalized in liturgy. Why? Because the early followers weren't just building temples of stone. They were trying to survive. The prayer became more than personal. It became a code, a binding agent, a way for scattered believers to hold one another across distance, persecution, exile. Still, something was lost, because when you say the prayer with a crowd, something sacred risks dissolving. You may hear your neighbor's voice louder than your own breath. You may feel more concerned about keeping pace than sinking inward. And in those moments, the door Yeshua told you to shut stays open. To noise, to eyes, to ego. So was it meant for public use? Not originally, not in the way we think. It was meant to be carried, not displayed. Whispers, not banners. A thread of consciousness running through your day, not a chant shouted across stadium speakers. The truest way to say it, perhaps, is the way it was first given. Alone, in stillness, with no one watching. Because that's where heaven meets earth, in silence. In secret, it sounded harmless, just words. But in the Roman Empire, words had teeth, and the wrong ones could get you nailed to wood. Thy kingdom come. That alone was sedition. To modern ears, it sounds like a wish, maybe even a dream. But to the ears of a Roman soldier, it was a challenge. Because in the empire of Caesar, there was already a kingdom, and it already had a god, Caesar himself. He was called Son of the Divine, Savior of the world, Bringer of peace. Those titles weren't poetic, they were political. Every coin bore his face, every temple echoed his name. So when a backwoods rabbi told his followers to pray for a different kingdom, one that came not from Rome but from heaven, it was a declaration of war in whispered breath. The prayer didn't ask Rome for permission. It didn't pay tribute to Caesar's rule. It said there was another Father, one who was in heaven, another will, one greater than the empire, another bread, not bought in the marketplace, another forgiveness, not granted by the state, another power, another glory, not Caesar's. And that kind of talk? That got people crucified. Early followers of the way didn't just hide in catacombs because they were shy. They hid because the words they spoke, words we now print on mugs and wall art, were once seen as treason. Every line of the Lord's Prayer chipped away at the myth of empire. It said the emperor was not ultimate. It said the poor would be fed without Rome. It said debts could be forgiven without banks. It said evil wasn't just personal, it had structure, system, thrones. To pray this aloud in a public square was to paint a target on your back. Even centuries later, when Rome converted, the danger never fully left. Because the prayer still has teeth. It still subverts power, questions wealth, threatens empires old or new. And maybe that's why it has survived. Because no matter how many governments try to co-opt it, no matter how many rulers drape it in gold, its heart remains dangerous. Thy kingdom come is still a rebellion, and every time someone prays it with true intent, not for show, not for comfort, but with fire in the gut, they join a long line of revolutionaries. Not with swords, but with breath, with hope, with a whisper that refuses to bow. The empire heard the prayer, and it trembled. It begins with a whisper in the sand. Long before Jesus spoke of daily bread or deliverance from evil, the priests of Egypt were already uttering prayers, sacred incantations written in ochre on papyrus, carved into tomb walls, or chanted through cracked lips beside the Nile. The Book of the Dead, as we call it now, wasn't a book at all, but a collection of spells, maps for the soul's journey after death. But here's the strange part. If you listen closely, some of those spells sound familiar. There is a passage that pleads, "Deliver me from the devourer who lives in the west," another that calls to the cosmic Father for sustenance. "Give me bread, day by day." A formula invoking protection, "Lead me not into the chambers of trial." They were survival tools for the afterlife, requests to higher realms for forgiveness, guidance, provision, and protection. Almost like a certain prayer you might have memorized as a child. Was Jesus borrowing from Egyptian thought? Or were both prayers tapping into something older, something deeper, embedded in the bones of human longing? Egyptian theology wasn't about punishment. It was about balance, ma'at, harmony between seen and unseen worlds. They prayed not to be judged unjustly, not to be tempted by illusions of power, not to forget the sacred name of the one who guides. And in some versions of the Book of the Dead, that one is addressed not with thunder, but with intimacy. A parent, a guardian, a breath. Just like our Father, the desert was not a place of silence. It was a crucible of belief. Egypt shaped Moses. Moses shaped the prophets shaped the Messiah. And so the echoes ripple. The Lord's Prayer, that simple scaffolding of breath and plea, might carry within it the fading chords of the Nile's ancient music. Not because it plagiarized, but because truth real, aching, human truth resurfaces in different places, across centuries. Like stars appearing in separate skies, we cry out for bread, for forgiveness, for guidance, for deliverance. Whether in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, or the syllables of a forgotten dynasty carved into limestone, the prayer may have changed languages. But the longing never did. And perhaps that's what makes it sacred. Not its originality, but its resonance. The way it calls from heart to heart, desert to desert, temple to tomb, a code we all carry. Even if we no longer remember why, it sounds gentle when whispered from a pew, a child's voice or an old woman's, saying, "Thy kingdom come," like a lullaby. But in the days when those words were first spoken aloud, they were anything but gentle. They were defiant. They were dangerous. They were a dagger slipped beneath the robes of empire. To say "Thy kingdom come" was to say Rome must fall, because kingdoms do not coexist. Not truly. Not when one is divine and the other claims divinity through blood, conquest, and coin. The Caesars styled themselves as gods, their statues set in temples, their names burned into coins and laws. Their kingdom had already come with armies, taxes, crucifixions. And now, from the mouth of a Galilean carpenter, came a rival proclamation. Not our kingdom, not may the empire flourish, but thy kingdom. Something other, something higher. It was a cry that stirred memory in Israel's bones. The prophets had once spoken of a king who would crush oppression, free captives, and rule with justice. And now Jesus tells them, pray like this. Ask for that kingdom. Long for it. Speak it into the air until it takes root in the dirt. And if the kingdom of heaven was to arrive, what of Caesar's? What of Herod's palaces? What of Pilate's tribunals? Every time the prayer was said aloud, it chipped away at Roman myth. Every syllable undermined the idea that power was inherited through violence. It reframed allegiance. It redrew borders. No longer temple or palace, but something invisible, eternal, planted in hearts and spreading like yeast through dough. This is why they feared him. Jesus did not organize militias. He offered no war cries. But he taught people to pray in a way that made the empire tremble. He taught peasants and lepers and fishermen to speak like citizens of another world. And not just to speak, but to expect it. To act as if the new kingdom had already begun. As if justice was already rewriting law. As if mercy now ruled instead of might. That is what made it resistance. Quiet, radiant rebellion. 2,000 years later, the words are often recited by rote, but in their bones, they still carry the tremor of revolution. Not a revolution of swords, but of sight, of what we long for, of what we choose to build in the ruins of broken systems. Because to say thy kingdom come is not to wish, it is to pledge. It does not begin with demand. It begins with awe, just like the Psalms, just like David. When Jesus gave the Lord's Prayer to his followers, he wasn't inventing something brand new. He was tapping into a much older current, a rhythm and shape carved by generations who had cried out to the divine in deserts, caves, and midnight terrors. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That is not unlike the opening of so many psalms. Bless the Lord, O my soul, or, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. The pattern is ancient. Begin by lifting your eyes. Begin by remembering who you're speaking to. Then comes the tension, the ache. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Not unlike David crying, how long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? Or make haste to help me, O God? It's not just a prayer. It's a collision of longing and belief, of hope pushing against the silence. Even the plea for bread has roots in older songs. You open your hand, and they are filled with good things. The eyes of all look to you. David sang those lines centuries before Jesus taught his prayer. And now the same spiritual hunger hums beneath the surface. But there's something more, something hidden in the structure. Hebrew poetry, like the Psalms, often moves in cycles. Praise, plea, confession, return to praise. The Lord's Prayer follows the same spiral. It opens with exaltation, descends into daily struggle and moral request, then rises again. Deliver us, for thine is the kingdom. It's not just about asking for things. It's about becoming aligned. The Psalms often shift midway, from despair to trust, from mourning to dancing, and so does the prayer. It mirrors the emotional architecture of worship, pulling you downward into need and repentance, only to lift you back into cosmic perspective. Some scholars believe that Jesus was weaving together fragments of temple songs and wilderness prayers, that he was not giving a speech, but singing a kind of compressed psalm, a distillation, a code made of cadence. When early Christians recited it together, they were not just speaking, they were stepping into a tradition of sacred pattern. They were walking paths David had carved, whispering phrases he might have understood had he lived to hear them in Aramaic. The Lord's Prayer, then, is not an interruption of the Psalms, it is their echo. And when you speak it, with full breath and quiet fire, you are not just praying like Jesus taught, you are singing with the voice of kings and prophets. It might sound impossible at first that a prayer taught in a dusty Galilean hillside could carry the fingerprints of a Persian prophet from 1,000 years earlier. But ancient ideas do not respect borders. They travel in silence, through exile, through empire, through whispers and borrowed words. And the Lord's Prayer, short as it is, may contain the distant echoes of Zoroaster. When the Babylonians tore Jerusalem apart and dragged its people eastward in chains, they thought they were ending something. But in exile, the Jewish people came into contact with something unexpected, a worldview shaped by Zoroastrianism, a cosmos of light and darkness, of coming judgment, of a divine will not just to forgive but to restore. Zoroastrianism spoke of a good God, Ahura Mazda, and his cosmic adversary, Angra Mainyu. The universe was a battlefield between truth and the lie, and every prayer, every act, had power in that struggle. Sound familiar? Now listen again to what Jesus says, "Deliver us from evil." Not just evil in the abstract, but evil as a force. In some early versions it even reads the evil one. That's not just moral language. That's dualistic language. And then, thy kingdom come, a kingdom not yet here, a future inbreaking of divine justice. That too mirrors Zoroastrian eschatology. They spoke of a coming savior figure, of resurrection, of a world purified by fire and returned to its original harmony. Did Jesus borrow from Zoroaster? Not directly, not as a student of Persian scriptures. But the currents of empire had already swirled these ideas through Judea long before Jesus ever spoke. The prophets of Israel, returning from Babylon, brought back more than homesickness. They brought apocalyptic hope. They brought the sense that history was a story with a climax, a war between light and shadow, and the prayer reflects that. The line between Jewish monotheism and Persian dualism is not a clean one. They rubbed against each other, blended at the edges, each shaping how the other imagined heaven, earth, and what lies beyond both. And so, when Jesus taught his followers to pray, he was not just handing them a list of requests. He was giving them a battle cry, a cosmic alignment, a way to speak light into a world wrapped in shadow. Some might find that idea troubling, as if it dilutes the purity of faith, but perhaps it does the opposite. Perhaps it shows just how far the divine is willing to reach, through empires, through exile, through time itself, until those ancient sparks finally ignited in the mouth of a carpenter's son. When most people hear the Lord's Prayer, they don't think about what it leaves out. But sometimes silence speaks louder than doctrine, and what's striking about the prayer Jesus taught is that it never once mentions sin, at least, not in the way we've come to expect. There is no mention of a fall in Eden, no invocation of guilt, no inherited curse from ancient ancestors who disobeyed in a garden. Instead, we get something much simpler, much more human. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Debts, not depravity, a transactional image, not a condemnation of nature, the idea of original sin that you were born flawed, broken, condemned before your first breath was not something Jesus ever said. It came centuries later, shaped by St. Augustine in the 4th century, filtered through Roman law and Latin theology. Before that, Many early Christian sects held a very different view, that humanity was born bearing the image of the divine, not fallen, but luminous. Forgetful, maybe, but not damned. And the Lord's Prayer reflects that older view. It's not the cry of a wretch. It's not begging for mercy from a wrathful judge. It's intimate. It's confident. It starts with, "Our Father," not "our Judge." It asks for bread, not punishment. It acknowledges human failure, but not as proof of worthlessness. Just something that can and should be forgiven, like a loan repaid or released. The line, "Lead us not into temptation," has often been twisted to imply that we're naturally prone to wander, that we can't help ourselves, that we're fundamentally broken. But that's not what the Aramaic suggests. In the older versions, the phrase can also mean, "Do not let us be led," or "Do not allow us to enter trials beyond our strength." It's a request for guidance, not a confession of weakness. So what if the prayer isn't about escaping sin but remembering blessing? What if it's a ritual of realignment, of tuning back in to who we were before shame was taught to us, before theology carved us up with labels like depraved, unworthy, fallen? What if the most radical part of the Lord's Prayer is not what it demands but what it assumes? That you were made for communion, not condemnation. That you were born bearing light, not burden. And that prayer isn't about pleading for love, but practicing remembrance of what was never lost. They were never called Christians. Not at first. Long before Rome took hold of the story, long before creeds and councils and cathedrals, there was a smaller, stranger name whispered in shadows: the Nazarenes. A sect on the fringe of both empire and temple, poor in coin but rich in vision. And it's here among these desert mystics and hidden teachers that the roots of the Lord's Prayer may truly lie. The word Nazarene didn't just mean someone from Nazareth. In older Aramaic circles, it could also imply someone set apart, one who guards, one who keeps watch, a watcher of vows, a keeper of inner laws. Some scholars link them to the ancient Nazarites, those who refrained from wine, from blades, from burial rites, who set themselves apart to commune more directly with the divine. John the Baptist may have been one. Jesus, too. Their practices were not just about belief, but breath. Not just about speech, but vibration. Prayer was not recital, it was resonance. And the Lord's Prayer, in this light, reads more like a coded chant than a casual conversation with God. Our Father who art in heaven wasn't simply a greeting. To the Nazarenes, Father might have meant the cosmic source, the origin beyond form, the breath before the word. Heaven wasn't a sky, it was the hidden realm of spirit, closer than your own heartbeat. Hallowed be thy name wasn't about reverence, it was activation. The name was the vibration, the frequency, the unspeakable resonance they believed the universe sang into being. Saying it was less about language and more about alignment. Each phrase of the prayer, then, was a step, a rung, a vibration, a breath on a ladder meant not to ascend into some distant paradise, but to re-enter the divine mind already within. The Nazarene Code was not about dogma, it was about access. The kingdom wasn't coming, it was hidden, waiting to be revealed. Forgiveness wasn't transactional, it was energetic, a release that unknotted the soul's own cords. Deliverance from evil was not a plea to escape damnation, but a call to clear the shadows, clouding awareness. It is said some lines were never meant to be spoken aloud by the uninitiated, only whispered in caves, in deserts, in stillness, only breathed after fasting, after silence, when the ego was thin and the spirit near. The prayer Jesus gave may not have been for the crowds. It may have been a doorway, a passphrase, a Nazarene code disguised as a children's rhyme, hidden in plain sight. And if so, it was never meant to be repeated without trembling. Something ancient stirs when the words are spoken not just in churches or whispered in hospital rooms, but deep inside the folds of the brain, where memory and rhythm live. The Lord's Prayer, short and simple on the surface, moves like a spell through the corridors of the nervous system. Even when recited in a language you don't fully understand, it feels like something. Why? Part of the answer lies in the structure. The cadence. The way the phrases rise and fall in balanced pairs, like waves washing over the mind. The brain adores pattern, especially the kind of repetition found in ancient prayers. Each phrase becomes a breath length, a moment to inhale and exhale, syncing with the heart, lowering the pulse, inviting presence. This is not accidental, it is design. Neurologically, prayer has been shown to activate the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with focus, empathy, and self-awareness. But this one lights up something older too. The limbic system, the seat of emotion, the amygdala, where fear lives. And strangely, even the temporal lobes, where mystical experiences are often recorded, it doesn't just calm the mind, it shifts it. Linguistically, the prayer speaks in elemental language: bread, kingdom, father, evil, forgiveness. There's no abstraction, no theology, just primal ideas dressed in accessible words. And when language taps the elemental, it bypasses intellectual resistance. You don't need to understand it to feel it. That is the genius of its simplicity. Emotionally, the prayer is a mirror. Whether whispered in despair or spoken in joy, it adapts. It folds around whatever burden you bring. It lifts your eyes to something bigger, but also pulls that bigger thing right down into your daily bread, your present fear, your need for mercy. It contains both the heavens and the kitchen table, and deeper still, on a subconscious level, it feels like home. Some believe this is because it echoes ancient mantras, sacred rhythms that have lived in human memory since the beginning. Others say it's because, whether you believe in God or not, the structure of the prayer speaks to something archetypal, a yearning for guidance, provision, protection, and peace, the things every human, in every culture, has always needed. But maybe the real reason it still works is because it was never just a prayer. It was a vibration, a map, a tuning fork for the soul, something that remembers the frequency of wholeness and invites you, word by word, to come back into harmony with it, to return home. Before language was written, it was sung. Before theology had footnotes, it had rhythm. And before the Lord's Prayer became a memorized recitation, it was a vibration, a living current carried on breath and sound. Somewhere in the spaces between the words, there is something else happening, something physical, something measurable. Sound is not just metaphor. It is movement through matter. When a person speaks, their vocal cords generate waves, compressions, and rarefactions in the air, traveling outward, shaping the world in ways the eye cannot see. Sacred language is not exempt. In fact, it may be the most potent example. Certain syllables, especially those rooted in ancient tongues like Aramaic, Hebrew, or Sanskrit, create vibrational patterns that influence both body and brain. The Lord's Prayer, when spoken aloud, especially in its older phonetic forms, has a resonance to it. Long vowel sounds, repeated consonant pairings, cadence and breath-spaced syllables. Neuroscientists studying chanting and rhythmic prayer have noted altered states in practitioners: slower heart rate, decreased activity in the default mode network, spikes in theta and alpha brainwaves frequencies associated with meditation, creativity, and sometimes even mystical experience. It is not imagination, it is physiology, but it is more than that. Some ancient mystics believed that sound was the first act of creation, that the universe itself was sung into being, not through ideas, but through frequency. The Hebrew word for word is dabar, but it also means action. Speech, in this view, does something. It changes the shape of the space it enters. When Jesus taught the prayer, he did not just give words. He gave rhythm, structure, a spoken formula that could stabilize a mind in chaos or elevate one in stillness. Even today, there are recordings of indigenous and monastic chants whose frequency patterns mirror those found in healing music, tuning forks, singing bowls, Gregorian tones. The Lord's Prayer, when broken down into vibratory patterns, sits remarkably close to these same therapeutic ranges, which raises the question, what if prayer was never meant to be silent? What if whispering, "Our Father," is not just an address to heaven, but an attunement to a deeper reality? What if the voice itself is the key, not for some external deity to hear, but for your own system to realign? In the end, words pass, but vibration stays. Long after the tongue rests, the body still echoes. And maybe that's what this prayer always was, not a sentence, a signal, a frequency woven into the very act of speaking, a resonance between flesh and spirit, meant not just to be understood but to be felt. What if the Lord's Prayer wasn't just a devotion, but a design, a kind of spiritual code, layered not only with meaning, but with function, each phrase an instruction, each breath a step in a deeper sequence? For centuries, mystics, scholars, and seekers have tried to climb toward the divine by reaching out. But what if this prayer was never about reaching up, but about unlocking something already within? From the first line, it creates orientation, not a request, but an anchoring. Our Father, not my Father, a collective invocation. Instantly, identity becomes communal. The self dissolves. Step 1. Dissolve ego. Next comes direction. Who art in heaven? Not a physical place, but a state above the noise, outside time. A reminder that what you're tuning into isn't bound by the material. Step 2. Shift perspective. Then comes a name hallowed, revered, not controlled or claimed, but sacred. Step 3. Humble the intention. The structure continues this way, each line pulling you further into alignment. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Not on a faraway mountaintop, but on earth as it is in heaven. Heaven, in this sense, is not elsewhere, it is how things are supposed to be. The prayer is not a plea for escape, but a download of divine order into the present. Then, and only then, comes the request for sustenance. Give us this day our daily bread. The phrase translated as daily is epiousios, found nowhere else in the ancient Greek world. Some say it means necessary for existence. Others believe it's something closer to super-essential, a kind of spiritual nourishment. Step 4. Receive the input, and then a recalibration of relationships. Forgive us, as we forgive. It is not a bargain, it's a mirror. The flow of grace is conditional only in the sense that it must move. Stagnant mercy ceases to be mercy. Step 5. Clear the system. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Evil here is not a vague darkness, it is the evil one, a force of entropy, of fragmentation. The prayer closes with a firewall, a shield, a protection against disintegration. Step 6. Preserve the alignment. When viewed this way, the Lord's Prayer becomes more than beautiful language. It becomes a process, a sequence, a spiritual algorithm, each line serving a function, realigning the human spirit with something it has forgotten but still contains, like a code buried in your cells, waiting to be activated, not with understanding, but with repetition, intention, breath. Maybe that is why it has lasted this long. Not because people believed it, but because, somehow, when spoken with presence, it works. Not magic, not superstition, just design, hidden in plain sight, a spiritual operating system disguised as a prayer. Modern science is finally catching up to something ancient mystics have whispered for centuries, that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's rewiring. When Jesus taught his followers to pray, "Forgive us, as we forgive," he wasn't offering moral advice. He was embedding a kind of neurological healing code, a feedback loop, a way to reset the brain from cycles of fear, bitterness, and trauma. In the last few decades, neuroscientists have begun studying what happens when people truly forgive, not just say the words, but embody them. Functional MRI scans show reduced activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats and triggering fight or flight responses. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for empathy, judgment, and long-term decision-making, lights up. In other words, forgiveness shifts the mind out of survival mode and into growth mode. But here's the catch. The brain cannot easily fake forgiveness. It knows the difference between words and intention. When Jesus tied our own forgiveness to the act of forgiving others, he may have been revealing something far deeper than theology. He was exposing the emotional circuitry. If you want release, you must release. If you want healing, you must not hoard pain. Trauma, left unprocessed, becomes architecture. It reshapes memory, perception, and even identity. The Lord's Prayer breaks this loop, not through logic, through repetition. The daily rhythm of "forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors," is not merely confession, it is renovation. A kind of mental hygiene. Saying it daily clears the static from old betrayals. It invites the nervous system to stand down. Over time, it shifts the very chemistry of the body, lowering cortisol, boosting oxytocin, even improving immune response. Forgiveness literally makes you harder to kill. And perhaps most strangely, the prayer makes no demand that the other person apologize first. It does not require justice or closure. It simply invites a release. In doing so, it decouples the act of forgiveness from the person being forgiven. It becomes about freedom, not theirs, yours. People often think of prayer as reaching upward, but in this case, the change happens inward, in neurons, in blood pressure, in the way a voice trembles less when saying a name from the past. The Lord's Prayer knew what psychology would one day confirm: that memory is plastic, and that compassion is neurochemical. You are not forgiving because they deserve it. You are forgiving because your brain cannot afford not to, and that somehow was already written into the breath of this ancient prayer. A divine therapy session, whispered across millennia, healing not just the soul, but the circuitry. The prayer begins with "Our Father," and for most, that sets the tone male, paternal, patriarchal. But that may not be the whole story. When Jesus first spoke the words aloud, he did not speak Greek or Latin or English. He spoke Aramaic, and in that sacred tongue, something subtle and astonishing stirs beneath the surface. The phrase Abun Dabashmaya, commonly translated as "Our Father who art in heaven," is far richer, far stranger. Abun is not strictly male. It is a fusion. It contains Abba, meaning father, but also shades of Woon, which carries nurturing, birthing, and sustaining overtones more akin to womb than warrior. Some mystics translate it as "O Birther," or "Source of all." Not a distant king on a throne, but a presence that pulses through the breath, through stars, through the deep silence beneath thought. A mothering father, a fathering womb, language struggling to contain something bigger than categories. For centuries, this nuance was lost or perhaps buried. The early church, formed in the shadow of empire and hierarchy, had little room for ambiguity. Masculine images were safer, clearer, more controllable. But hidden in that first word is the feminine principle, veiled in syllables. Not to feminize God, but to reveal a balance that transcends gender entirely. Jesus never said God is a man. He said God is spirit, and spirit has no anatomy. The structure of the prayer also hints at something cyclical, organic, rhythmic traits often associated with the feminine divine. It speaks in breath-like phrases, soft implorations, and echoes of relationship and receptivity. It is not about conquest. It is about connection. Thy kingdom come is not a war cry. It is a surrender, a longing, a midwife's whisper to the unfolding now. Even the recurring use of daily bread sustenance, nourishment evokes the maternal, not as metaphor, but as metaphysical law. The prayer feeds, cradles, heals. It is a lullaby for the soul. It does not command lightning. It calls for inner transformation. What if the sacred feminine was never missing? What if she was always there, just misheard, hidden in the root syllables, cloaked in the breath between lines? The mother, present in the father, the divine, whole in its paradox. And perhaps that is the final shock. Not that we have been praying the Lord's Prayer wrong, but that we have been hearing it through the wrong ears. With filters shaped by centuries of hierarchy and omission, the text has not changed, but the listener must. The breath still speaks the fullness, if we dare to listen for what was always softly there. In the year 2017, something quietly seismic happened. Pope Francis approved a revision to one of the most ancient, most memorized phrases in the Christian world. For generations, billions of lips had uttered the words, "Lead us not into temptation." But now, Rome said, that line had never quite been right. The change did not make front-page headlines in every country, but in spiritual circles, it sent ripples. The new phrasing, at least in some liturgical translations, would read, "Do not let us fall into temptation." A subtle shift, but one with profound theological weight. Because what kind of father, after all, would lead his children into temptation? The implication was uncomfortable, even dangerous. For centuries, translators had carried that phrase forward from the Greek mi eisenenkes, himas eis peresmon, as if God himself were the tester, the tempter. But Pope Francis challenged that. "It is not God who throws me into temptation," he said. "It is Satan." To the Vatican, this was not rewriting scripture, it was recovering its intent. The original Aramaic, spoken by Jesus, likely carried a different cadence, one closer to protection than trial. And the Greek itself is ambiguous. The verb eisenenkes means to bring into or to carry toward, but it does not say why. Was it active direction, passive allowance? Linguistic fog hangs heavy over sacred texts. The Pope's decision was pastoral as much as theological. He wanted clarity, comfort, a prayer that reflected God's mercy, not confusion. Critics, however, were quick to accuse him of tampering with holy words. They feared a slippery slope. If one line could change, what next? But others pointed to precedent. The Bible itself is a history of evolution, oral traditions becoming scrolls, scrolls becoming canons, canons spawning translations, interpretations, divisions. The Lord's Prayer, though ancient, has never been frozen. It has moved across tongues, empires, continents, always slightly shifting like light through stained glass. In that light, the Vatican's revision is less a break than a continuation, a recognition that divine meaning must sometimes be reclarified for human ears, that we grow into our understanding of sacred language, and sometimes the words must grow with us. The new line does not erase the old one. It sits beside it, offering an alternate hearing, a lens tilted just slightly. And perhaps that is the essence of prayer, not rigid recitation, but living dialogue, a sacred phrase that can breathe again in each generation, reshaped not by power, but by love's insistence that God would never lead us toward harm but only toward healing. In the hushed hours before dawn, when the world held its breath and the veil between realms felt thinnest, they said the prayer out loud and heard something whisper back. Not all mystics wrote it down. Many never dared. But stories echo through monasteries, desert caves, and candlelit chapels, tales of monks and seekers who, while praying the Lord's Prayer with full presence, began to hear it speak through them, not merely as words recited, but as something alive, as if hidden layers, frequencies, or voices rose from beneath the syllables like a second current beneath a quiet stream. One tale comes from a Syrian anchorite in the 4th century, who reportedly heard a phrase that was not part of the prayer at all, the silence beneath the name. He described it not as a sound, but as a knowing, something vast and mothering that pulsed in the pause between Our Father and Who art in heaven. He wept for 3 days after. In the hills of medieval Spain, Saint Teresa of Avila once confided to her spiritual companion that while reciting "On earth as it is in heaven," she suddenly heard her own voice stop and another voice, softer and more ancient, finish the line. She never repeated what it said, only that it had changed everything. From that moment forward, she claimed her soul no longer prayed to God, but with God. And then there is the record of an anonymous Carthusian monk from the 15th century, who wrote that each time I whispered, "Give us this day our daily bread," I heard a second voice beneath mine, not echoing but correcting. Not bread, light. Not now. Modern psychologists might label it auditory hallucination. But these mystics were not ill. They were disciplined, silent, fasting, awake. They were not seeking to bend the world, but to listen to it. And in that deep listening, the Lord's Prayer became more than a formula. It became a kind of spiritual stethoscope, pressed against the chest of the cosmos. What they heard may not have been literal sound, but resonance, meaning vibrating at a level beneath language. Perhaps the whisper was always there, and only those emptied of ego and clamor could hear it. Perhaps the words of the prayer are like keys on a piano. Most of us play them simply, but every so often, someone touches the chord just right, and another note hums from the unseen. What did they hear? We may never know. But they all agreed on this. The prayer was never silent, not truly. And if we listen not just with ears, but with the whole of our being, something ancient might begin to whisper back. A child lies in bed, the covers pulled up just beneath the chin. The light from the hallway, a dim sliver on the wall. And from the darkened room, a whisper, "Our Father, who art in heaven." It's supposed to bring comfort. But for many, it never quite did. For centuries, children across the world have been taught to recite the Lord's Prayer before sleep. It became ritual, lullaby, and shield, but it also carried weight words that, depending on the child's world, could feel either like a soft embrace or a chain forged in fear. Because while the cadence is soothing, the content is cosmic. Kingdoms, power, temptation, evil, heavy concepts in small mouths. In homes where love was present, the prayer settled like a warm blanket. "Thy will be done" sounded like trust. "Deliver us from evil" was a ward against monsters, both real and imagined. The rhythm itself became breathwork, a heartbeat that slowed the mind and stilled the hands. Sleep came gently, but in homes where love was fractured or where religion was wielded as discipline, the same words became something else entirely. "Forgive us our trespasses" carried the weight of guilt. "Lead us not into temptation" turned every mistake into a moral threat. "Thine is the kingdom" meant someone was always watching, always judging. Some children said the prayer every night and never felt alone. Others said it and never felt safe. Psychologists today understand how bedtime rituals can shape the emotional architecture of a child's brain. Repetition, rhythm, and belief, all powerful tools in laying down neural pathways. A prayer spoken nightly becomes more than words. It becomes the air between waking and dreaming. If fear has taken root, the prayer can deepen it. If love holds the space, the prayer can soften it. One former nun once described her childhood nights not as restful but as battles. She would say the prayer to stop the nightmares, but sometimes the nightmares began during the prayer. In her adult years, she revisited the words not as a believer, but as a wounded child. She rewrote the lines to reclaim them, transforming "Our Father" into "Our Love," and deliver us from evil and to hold us through the dark. For the first time, she said, she felt heard. The paradox of the Lord's Prayer at bedtime is this. It has been both a comfort and a cage, a melody of mercy and a reminder of fear, and yet it endures, not because of the words alone, but because of what we hope they mean. Maybe the prayer was never meant to protect us from monsters. Maybe it was meant to remind us that someone somewhere is listening when we whisper into the dark. They say the wind in Galilee still whispers his language, that if you listen carefully enough, as it dances through the olive trees or ripples across the Sea of Tiberias, you can almost hear it, the original voice. Not Latin, not Greek, but the rugged, flowing syllables of first-century Galilean Aramaic, the tongue of Yeshua. Scholars have tried for decades to reconstruct how the Lord's Prayer might have sounded when first spoken, not written, but breathed, passed not as ink on scroll, but voice on air. In Yeshua's world, prayers were not cold lines to be recited, but living rhythms, tied to memory, chant, and breath. The mouth shaped the meaning as much as the words did. In Aramaic, the prayer begins not with Our Father, but with something far more intimate, expansive, and mysterious, Abun Debwashmaya, a word that blends the masculine and feminine, the protector and the birther. Some translate it as, O birther, father, mother of the cosmos. Others say the word contains the breath of origin itself. Not simply a name, but a vibration. The cadence continues, rising and falling like the hills of Galilee. Neth Kadash Shmak, let your name be made holy. Tati Malkuthak, let your kingdom come. The words pulse with longing, not command. It is not a list of demands to a distant God, but a weaving of harmony between the human and the divine. What changes when we hear it this way is not just the sound, but the soul of the prayer. In English, we hear sharp consonants, clear clauses, and solemnity. But in the reconstructed Galilean phrasing, the prayer feels like a river. It loops, it breathes, it does not declare so much as invite. There is no hard stop after on earth as it is in heaven, no pause that turns forgiveness into a transaction. Instead, it flows one gesture into the next, one breath birthing another. Some researchers now believe this oral rhythm was the key all along. The prayer may have been designed not just to be said, but sung not for churches, but for caves, fields, and doorways, for secret moments. And when spoken aloud in the old sounds, something strange happens. People report feeling lighter, calmer, connected as if their voice is echoing a memory they never lived, but somehow always knew. To rediscover the original voice is not just to reach back in time. It is to reawaken a sound woven into the bones of the world. The sound of surrender, the sound of trust, the sound of a man standing barefoot on a hillside, speaking to the sky and knowing he was heard. Maybe the greatest secret is this: you've been praying it wrong your whole life, and that might be exactly why it still works. For centuries, scholars have debated the right way to say the Lord's Prayer. Should it be in Greek, Aramaic, Latin, English? Is it debts or trespasses? Lead us not, or do not let us fall. Thousands of voices, thousands of versions, and yet the prayer endures. It has passed from lips in prison cells and hospital beds, in bunkers and pews, whispered by monks and shouted by children, all of them slightly different, all of them somehow the same, and that raises a strange possibility. Maybe it was never meant to be static. Maybe the power of the prayer isn't in getting it right, but in the way it reshapes itself to meet us wherever, whenever, however we are. Every line holds layers. Daily bread becomes a symbol of food, yes, but also love, survival, clarity, even hope. Thy kingdom come sounds like rebellion under empire, but also like inner transformation. Forgive us can be cosmic release, or a whispered apology to someone sleeping beside us. We've tried to nail it down for centuries, to define it, translate it, tame it, but like a river, It slips through definitions. The more we try to freeze it, the more it reminds us. Prayer is not a performance. It is a relationship. And what if misunderstanding is part of the design? What if mishearing it in childhood, stumbling through the rhythm, twisting the words, was part of what made it yours? Maybe your version, however flawed, was always sacred. Maybe mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a space to enter. There is beauty in the evolution. A fisherman muttering it in Galilee, a rebel whispering it under Roman rule, a prisoner mouthing it through iron bars, a mother saying it over her child's fevered body, a soldier in a trench, a doubter in a dark night, a seeker with no words left. All of them praying wrong, and all of them praying right. The Lord's Prayer may not be a single thing. It may be a doorway, a song you never sing the same way twice, a key that changes the lock depending on what room you most need to enter. So here's the final twist. Maybe you don't need to fix your prayer. Maybe you need to trust it. In all its confusion and imperfection, in all its mystery and evolution, because sometimes the words aren't perfect, but the reaching island, and that's where heaven answers.